Good evening. Welcome to the 98th Annual National Communication Association Convention. I'm Steve Beebe, First Vice President of NCA, and on behalf of President Rich West, I'm delighted that you could be with us this evening. I welcome not only those of you here in the hall, but also those of you who are joining us via the internet. We welcome you tonight as well. And I want to especially thank our sponsor this evening, Routledge Taylor & Francis, publisher of our NCA journals and a world leader in scholarly publications. We appreciate their support, their continuing support with NCA, both past, present, and in the future. So my question for you this evening is, why are you here? Perhaps phrased slightly differently, why are we here? What unites us in our study of human communication? This opening general session, celebrating what unites us, is designed to explore those questions. Perhaps you've heard, I have, or maybe you've even said, NCA is too big. There are too many units, or interestingly, as our Constitution calls them, there are too many divisions within NCA. I've asked three well-known communication scholars to speak with us this evening to explore this question. What concepts, ideas, and principles unite the communication discipline? We like to trace our history back. We're very proud of tracing it back over 2,500 years. Yet the past 98 years has seen dramatic changes in the methods, in the contexts, and in the approaches to the study of communication. And as we contemplate celebrating our centennial as a professional association, this evening we explore what unites us as an association. Now, I want to make it clear our goal this evening is not to identify a single perspective, but rather to have a conversation about the principles and ideas that give us a sense of community. As I thought about this evening, while even fine-tuning the theme for this convention, I had each of these three speakers in mind. I had three criteria for speakers this evening. First, they should be an outstanding scholar. Second, they should be an excellent educator. And third, they should be a good speaker as well. Our three speakers this evening certainly exceed each of these three criteria. And our format is a simple one. I will introduce all of the speakers, and then each will speak for 15 or 20 minutes, sharing their ideas with us. But I want to emphasize that the conversation doesn't end there this evening. Tomorrow morning at 9:30, I hope to see many of you just next door in the Hemisphere 4 room, where each of our speakers will briefly, and I've given the option, they can either summarize their remarks this evening, or maybe they want to have a commentary and respond to something they heard this evening, and then we'll open it up for you to join in the conversation. In fact, if you were the one invited to give the speech this evening, what would you say unites the study of communication? You'll have an opportunity to answer that question tomorrow morning. Our speakers. First, Dr. Kory Floyd. Dr. Floyd is Professor and Associate Director of Human Communication at Arizona State University. His research focuses on the and on the interplay between affectionate behavior, physiology, and health. He's director of the Communication Sciences Laboratory at Arizona State, which studies endocrine, immune, and cardiovascular effects of communication. He's authored 9 books and nearly 75 journal articles and book chapters on topics of interpersonal communication, affection, family relationships, nonverbal communication, and health. He's a former chair of the Family Communication Division of NCA and a former editor of the Journal of Family Communication. He's also the incoming editor of Communication Monographs. He received his PhD from the University of Arizona, and Professor Floyd has won several NCA awards, including the Charles H. Woolbert Award, Research Award for a research article that has stood the test of time. He's also received the Bernard J. Brommel Award for Outstanding Scholarship and Distinguished Service in Family Communication. I mentioned that I was seeking excellent speakers. It's about a year and a half, maybe close to 2 years, that Kory spoke at Texas State University, and I was so impressed with not only his knowledge, but the way he models excellence in communication. I think you'll enjoy hearing from Dr. Floyd shortly. Our second speaker is Dr. Navita Cummings James. Professor James earned her PhD in communication at The Ohio State University and has been a faculty member in the Department of Communication at the University of South Florida in Tampa since 1981. For 10 years, she was also USF's Director of Africana Studies, and she has been recognized many times for both her outstanding teaching as well as her outstanding service. In our profession, Dr. James is a former president of the Southern Communication Association. He's been an active member of NCA for the past 31 years. Her many roles in NCA have included chair of the Finance Board, member of the Executive Committee, 3 times on the Legislative Assembly, and chair of the Mass Communication Division. Her recent teaching and research publications focus on diversity in communication, including social constructions of race in film, diversity in communication pedagogy, and feminist spirituality. Public service has been an important part of her career, and in Florida, she chaired the Florida Commission on the Status of Women and was a public member of the Florida Judicial Management Council. Nationally, she is 3 times elected deputy to the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. I've had the joy and privilege of knowing Navita for at least 3 decades. When I started my career as an assistant professor at the University of Miami, I first met her at Florida Communication Association meetings, as well as at the Southern States Communication Association. Whenever Navita speaks, people listen to her. I know you're going to enjoy listening to her this evening. Our third speaker, Dr. Kathleen Hall Jamieson. Professor Jamieson is the Elizabeth Ware Packard Professor of Communication at the Annenberg School of Communication for Walter and the Walter and Lenore Annenberg Director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and the International Communication Association. She is the author or co-author of 16 books, including Presidents Creating the Presidency, Echo Chamber, Rush Limbaugh and the Conservative Media Establishment, Finding Facts in a World of Disinformation, and with Kate Kinski and Bruce Hardy, Professor Jamieson co-authored The Obama Victory, which was winner of the American Publishers Award for Professional and Scholarly Excellence in Government and Politics and the ICA Outstanding Book Award. Jamieson has won university-wide teaching awards at each of the 3 universities at which she has taught, and political science or communication awards for 5 of her books. She is founder of the new public literacy site, flakcheck.org, which uses parody and humor to debunk false political advertising, poke fun at extreme language, and hold the media accountable for the reporting on political campaigns. I've known Kathleen for several years as well. When I was a brand new green department chair at what was then Southwest Texas State, Kathleen was chair at the University of Texas just up the road, and she was always so very kind, generous, and supportive of me. It's my great privilege and my great joy to now listen to these 3 outstanding speakers.
Thank you. So I don't know about you, but I find it annoying to see animals in clothing. My next door neighbor used to have this dog, sort of this little toy poodle something or other, looked like a fluffy rat. And in the wintertime, and bear in mind I live in Arizona where winter is like spring, in most places she would dress this thing up in little sweaters and scarves. One time she even put this little puffball thing at the end of its tail, and I thought, how embarrassing this must be for this little dog in front of all its other little dog friends. Now, maybe you find that behavior cute. And if so, then that's something that does not unite you and me. I find it annoying. And that's partly because nature already saw to it that that dog got the fur coat it needed to keep warm when it was faced with the elements. As humans, you and I didn't acquire that advantage, and so we adapt to our environmental needs by shopping. Finding clothes for our bodies and shoes for our feet, keeping our consumer economy humming right along. There are many things that we, as humans, are the only creatures on our planet to do. Use computers, drive cars, make popcorn, go to Disney World, study communication. We've created art and language and music. We've developed agriculture and domesticated animals, built bridges and palaces, captured fire and refined the methods of science, put men on the moon and a rover on Mars. As human beings, we sit alone, virtually unchallenged, atop the proverbial food chain. What a seductive idea, then, that human social behavior is also unparalleled in the natural world. How tantalizing to think of human communication as wholly unique. And that only makes sense when you consider all of the other ways that humans are wholly unique in the known world. But let me suggest today that as students of human behavior, you and I consider what we can learn about our behavior by recognizing its connection to the broader biological web. What unites us as a discipline is the fact that we all belong to the physical world. I'm going to suggest today that we learn to look beyond ourselves then, so that we might better understand ourselves. So, what kind of beings are we? Well, we're social and we're cultural. We're political and religious. We're artistic and economic, gendered and philosophical. We are all of these things. And our discipline does a fine job of exploring how these influences affect our behavior on a day-to-day basis. But besides being cultural and religious, artistic and gendered, we're also hominids, like the great apes. We're also mammals, like woolly lemurs, like blue whales and bats. We're animals, like eagles and starfish, and my neighbor's little sweater-wearing rat dog. It's certainly easy to think about lemurs and whales and starfish and say that we as human beings have nothing in common with all of those other creatures, but is that the truth? Are we humans the only ones who fight over resources? Are we the only ones who care for our offspring? Is it only humans who experience attraction or crave power and status? Are we the only ones who have conflict over territory or over mates? Is it just us who can be cunning and deceptive or coy and submissive? Are we humans the only ones who communicate? Well, the answer to all of these questions, of course, is no. But the story gets even more compelling when you look beyond our surface similarities. See, nature favors patterns in social interaction. What's true for human behavior is often true for the behavior of other species. As one example, let's consider the very well-documented finding that in most human cultures, women contribute substantially more time and energy than men do toward raising and nurturing children. Women communicate with kids more, they spend more time with them, and they bear the brunt of caretaking responsibilities in the family. The fact that this sex difference is observed virtually worldwide seems far from coincidental to social scientists when they realize that another cultural characteristic, patriarchy, is also observed virtually worldwide. For us as students of human social behavior to think of a sex difference like this as a logical outcome of patriarchy. It makes good sense, that is, until we look beyond ourselves and realize just how common that sex difference is. Remember, nature favors patterns in social interaction. Females don't invest more than males in childcare only among us humans. It turns out we have that in common with spiders and hummingbirds, rhinos and armadillos. It would certainly be a stretch to claim that patriarchy, a human construction, after all, accounts for variance in spider behavior. The inquisitive mind has to wonder then why a social behavior that isn't unique to humans ought to have a theoretic explanation that is. Today, I'm going to propose that it ought not to. Today, I would propose that we as scholars recognize that we as humans live within and not beyond the broader biological world, and that the same is true for the people whose communication behaviors we seek to understand. What unites us as a discipline is that we all inhabit the same physical world, subject to the same physical potentials, limitations, and laws. We each have 46 chromosomes and 206 bones, 650-some skeletal muscles, and around 60,000 miles of blood vessels in our bodies. We're all subject to senescence, the biological process of aging, and to the ways that affects our communication skills, both positively and negatively. Each of us was born, and each of us will cease to live. We are all capable of reasoning, and we're all capable of letting emotion overcome our reasoning. We all feel stress, and we all need sleep. Now, minus some variation in the numbers of chromosomes and skeletal muscles, we share virtually all of those characteristics with many other species as well. Ours, therefore, is a place within the biological world. And so to ignore biology as a frame of explanation for any social behavior, including communication, is to handicap our understanding of who we are and what we do. Now, our discipline has made some important strides in offsetting that deficit. We now look regularly at the body's physiology, the brain, the cardiovascular system, the endocrine and immune systems, and at the body's genetic constitution to understand how they affect and are affected by communication behavior. We use principles of natural selection to derive testable hypotheses about differences in individual and group behavior that are neither culturally nor historically bound. And maybe most usefully, we test communicative behavioral interventions for their ability to improve health-related outcomes. This work, I think, has extraordinary potential for making communication research applications relevant to the lives of many, but it requires acknowledging the living, breathing, biological nature of who we are as communicators. In last year's new edition of the Handbook of Interpersonal Communication, my colleague Tammy Afifi and I made the claim that all interpersonal communication acts are biological acts. That may sound like a grand, even overreaching claim until you think about it a little. Let me reiterate the example that I gave in our article. What does it take just to produce a spoken word? Now, production of a spoken word, just like the ones I'm speaking now, requires a highly intricate coordination between my cerebral cortex, my spinal cord, my respiratory system, laryngeal complex, and the muscles in my soft palate, my tongue, and lips. Your decoding my words depends on an equally intricate collaboration between your tympanic membrane, the ossicles and cochlea in your ears, your spinal cord, and your cerebral cortex. Without all of those systems working in harmony both in your body and in mine, interpersonal communication between you and me cannot exist. There's more. If you appreciate what I have to say, your vascular system is elevating your skin temperature, and you may have increases in neurotransmitters, such as dopamine. If you're sitting there objecting to my words, you're probably experiencing muscle tension, the temporary suppression of your immune system, maybe the elevation of stress hormones like cortisol in your bloodstream. Any of these physical reactions might happen quickly or slowly, with or without your awareness, but they happen nonetheless, as your central nervous system continually surveys your environment and readies your bodily response to it. Now, producing and understanding a spoken word is a simple communication act. Let's think about the more complex phenomena we deal with as social scholars. We know that culture affects communication behavior, and culture isn't biological. It's not encoded into our DNA. So why is biology relevant? Well, we learn a culture. The process of enculturation is a learning process. Through narratives and traditions, rituals and artifacts, we learn what it means to belong to this culture or that. So let's think about what that requires. You need sensory abilities of some sort, touch, vision, hearing, and such, to be able to hear a narrative or see an artifact. You need enough cognitive ability to give meaning to what you're sensing. Not just to understand the language that a narrative is in, but to make sense of the meaning that's in it. You need a sufficient memory in which to store these pieces of cultural knowledge and the cognitive capacity to understand the connections between them. And you need the motor capacity to enact whatever cultural behaviors are called for, whether it's to speak in a certain way or dress in a certain way, sing a particular song, or repeat a particular cultural story. Culture then can affect a wide swath of communication behavior, but it relies on a cadre of biological capabilities to do so. No society could successfully enculturate a newborn baby or a goldfish or a dead person. And that's not because culture isn't a powerful influence on behavior, but because those entities lack the basic biological mechanisms to be affected by it. Now, that argument's not at all unique to culture. We can make the same observation about much of what we study in our discipline: media messages, methods of persuasion and instruction, gender roles, nonverbal gestures. All of these are profoundly influential, but only if the biology is in place. What unites us as a discipline is that everyone we study is a biological being, and virtually everything we study assumes the presence of a complex biological system that is necessary for communication to occur and for communication to have effect. So what's the bottom line then? Do we all need to study biology in order to understand communication? No, we don't. Do we all need to even understand biology to understand communication? I would say not really. We're an academic discipline, and no matter what unites us, we come together in this discipline, we come together in this place with a diversity of training, with a range of perspectives, and with myriad interests. And you don't need to think as I do or study what I study. There's a place for all of us at this table. And that's one of the beautiful things about the academic life. The bottom line, I think, is that we shouldn't let our freedom in that academic life blind us to basic fundamental truths that affect all of us and therefore the behavior of all of us. Whether you're a logical positivist or a critical feminist, you were the product of internal gestation. Whether you're an experimentalist or an ethnographer, you're warm-blooded and you breathe air. Grad student or full professor, you are subject to biological motives and limitations that have characterized our species for millennia. And so it is for every participant whose communication we study. In all our theorizing and all our speculating about why this group or that group behaves as it does, let's not forget that the reason might not be found in the social, the cultural, the political, the religious, the artistic, the gendered, or the philosophical realms. It might not be the result of patriarchy or violence in the media. If we keep our minds open to the possibility, we may find that the answer to much of what intrigues us about human behavior lies in what unites us with each other and with the broader world beyond ourselves. Biology will never tell us the whole story about communication. That said, we'll never be in a position to understand the whole story about communication without understanding our biology, our evolution, and our place in this world. Thank you.
Let's see if this works. Oh, it does. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on what unifies us as a discipline. I want to take this opportunity to thank Stephen Beebe for asking me to think aloud with the members of my home academic community about what unifies us. And if I were to focus on when did I join this community, I would have to say when and where I entered communication was 40 years ago as a speech communication major at The Ohio State University. And yes, "the" is officially in the name of the university. As a graduate student, my first communication conferences were actually ICA's, Tom McCain. I first visited NCA in 1980, and later I joined both the Department of Communication and the then Speech Communication Association. My pathway in this association, as Steve indicated by his introduction, went through mass communication, but it also went through the Women's Caucus and the Black Caucus. Those were instrumental in the development of formulating who I am standing before you today. And again, I think that I'm somewhat of a service critter in that I like and I guess this is part of my own spirituality, to whom much is given, much is expected. If you have gifts in certain areas and an organization needs them, I have been forthcoming in sharing those. So when Stephen asked us to think about what unifies us, well, I said yes. And I have identified 3 concepts that I argue on the one hand, or offer on the other hand, that bring us together. And what I want to do here is very briefly identify what they are, and I want to suggest that we as a discipline are already doing them, and then perhaps, and we're doing them in our teaching and our scholarship and our research and how we serve our professions, our associations, as well as our communities. And I also then will link some of them with some other significant constructs or ideas that are prevalent in our field today. So, let me suggest that the first area that unifies us is that what you might look at and say, doesn't that word mean separate? Well, my argument is that diversity unifies us. I was very delighted just before our speech to see Linda Moore come in the room. 20 years ago, Linda Moore and I, as vice presidents of our respective regional associations, were thrown into the pit of a joint convention. And we didn't have technology to help us put together this convention. And we came together and said, what will be our theme? And the 2 things that came up in our discussion, let's talk about our unity as it relates to our diversity. And so 20 years later, I think we've come full circle. And I think 20 years ago, it might have been controversial, but I don't think it's controversial now. By diversity, I mean those differentiated areas of the lived human communicative experience significant meanings. Often, but not always, these differentiated experiences are associated with some aspect of our physical bodies, Kory. Our biological sex, our sexual attractions, the colors of our skin, our ages, our physical abilities. And then there are additional meaningful experiences, while not necessarily directly linked to the bodies with which we are born, are still significantly etched onto our bodies by time and place, circumstance, social systems, cultural practices, and these could include diversity categories that, such as religion or social class. So herein lies my first related area to diversity, embodiment. Our bodies matter. We all know that there is no such thing as a neutral body. We are all gendered, we are raced, we are classed. White is not neutral, and male is not norm. Nor maybe is always patriarchy. I do agree with those who say on some level that we are all the same beyond our diversity categories. But that may take me to a different place than some of you. For I would say that is the place where we find the soul, where we find the spirit, or maybe even that divine spark or energy. Or to bring it back to social science language that some of you are more comfortable with, the self. It is through the body that the self connects and knows the world. The self cannot know the physical world without being enfleshed, incarnated, embodied. In this framework, then, the body is the mediator of experience. And it is through this mediated process that identity, relationships, and reality are constructed. And therein, I think you hear 2 other related areas, one of which is relationships or relationality, and the other is social construction. I argue that all of our diversity categories are social constructions. Our cultures tell us what those categories mean, and if they're meaningful. If left-handedness was viewed as a meaningful construction that grouped and separated people, NCA might today have a division of left-handed communication, but obviously we don't. Well, in my work, diversity refers to gender and sexuality, and I kind of lump those together because I find it really difficult to split them out. And if that's difficult to keep together, I also lump together race, ethnicity, nationality, and transnationality, because those are, of course, interconnected. Social class, age and age cohorts, and I define age as our chronological age and age cohorts as generations, our physical abilities, religion, and spirituality. And I should note that this by no means is an exhaustive list of the way we group ourselves. Last week, red and blue states might have been meaningful. This week, military and civilian communication might be meaningful. I want to assure you, however, that to me, none of these diversity areas are essentialist. I do suggest that biology might matter in some, but surprisingly, in some areas where we thought biology was important, like race, not so much anymore. And in other areas where we have perhaps not paid as much attention to biology, maybe we should pay more attention, like sexual orientation and attraction. And I believe it was a few years ago, I don't know if Celeste Condit is here, but she stood addressing us in a lecture asking us to pay attention to biology. I know how dangerous biology has been in the past, but I guess some of us are gravitating to the area to say we should pay attention to that. So back to my argument of NCA. I argue NCA does diversity. If you've been around as long as I have, you don't even have to look for data. You just have to look at the people in the room, because it used to be almost all white male. Not anymore. But another way that we can look at it is by looking at those interest groups. The NCA refers to our caucuses and our divisions as interest groups. And we have 60 interest groups. Guess what? 16, or roughly 25% of those, deal with diversity. Gender, in the gender category, and this, of course I may have left something out, but in gender we have 2 categories, and note the history of our association. A caucus begets academic division. In race, ethnicity, nationality, and transnationality, I would argue that we have 7. At least. In age and age cohorts, we have 1 division. Religion and spirituality, we have 2, if we can include the Religious Communication Association. So we are doing diversity. And my argument here is that diversity matters in very profound ways. Oh, sexuality and physical abilities, don't forget those. Now, let's now look ahead. I could talk on and on about diversity, but the area that we have the most representation in our association is dealing with race, ethnicity, nationality, transnationality. And so all of us in here know by the year 2042, we are projected to be a majority-minority nation. And a lot of us are waiting for that. That's going to be in 30 years. And I've been in this association 30 years. So those of you who are young, graduate students, young professors, you're still going to be teaching if the academy still exists. You're still going to be teaching, and you're going to be in a different world. Well, I want to suggest the future is now. If we're looking at age cohorts, the younger age cohorts in some places in the country, babies of color now already outnumber white babies. And so Generation Z is going to be hitting our college classrooms in 4 to 6 years, and they're going to be coming in with more rainbow colors than we've had in the past. The other telling story is the 2012 election. I think most of us have seen these numbers on the news, and what I want you to look at is the first line. Only 39% of the white electorate elected Obama. 59% went for the other guy. But look at the other groups. 93% of black. I really want to know who those other 6% are. 71% of Latinos and 73% of Asians. This was an election that wasn't your father's, particularly if you're white, it wasn't your father's election. And it wasn't just people of color. 67% of unmarried women went for Obama, 60% of young adults. We are going through significant changes now, not 2042, now. And we have a responsibility, I would argue, as educators, to let that be reflected in our research and prepare our students for that experience. So, My argument, of course, I can talk about globalization, but I'm not. But obviously that fits in with diversity. So I know there's some people here who probably say, well, wait a minute, NCA does diversity, but we're not doing it right. I'm not saying we do it perfectly. Again, at Southern, many years ago, I made the argument that diversity should be at the center of communication theory, the center of what we do, not on the periphery. And some people might be afraid that a lot of what we're doing is on the periphery. Don't let that happen. In fact, a point of personal privilege, I'd like everyone in here, this convention, to say, I'm going to go to a diversity-related panel that has nothing to do with my lived experience. I bet you and your students will be the richer for that. The next area that I want to talk about is emergence. Emergence is a term that some of you are familiar with. Nicholas Riggs, I know that's something you really love. And what it is talking about is that we are living in an era of change. Emergence is often tied with what we might call new communication technologies or new media, and the resulting changes that occur with that in our identities, relationships, institutions, societies, cultures, and I love this one, even human consciousness itself. How am I using technology? Going back to some old discussions that suggest technologies are extensions of the human body. The wheel is the extension of the foot, the hammer the extension of the hand, and communication technologies may be as extensions of the mind. And again, if you're not, at least say that they are related to what occurs when the communication technologies, when we extend or alter the capabilities of and relationships of our embodied senses involved in communicating. But what I find really remarkable, and I'm not alone, and even breathtaking about the diffusion of new communication technologies in the 21st century is not just the technologies themselves, but the increasing and rapid rates at which they are being introduced, being adopted, and the visible and important consequences we see happening as a result. Think about it. It used to take centuries and then decades for new communication technologies to take hold. And I could even go back to talk about the spoken word or the alphabet as a technology. Thank you, Father Walter Ong. But let's talk about things that we punctuate the study of communication studies with: the printing press, a long period of time, then the telephone, I should say landline telephone, phonograph, radio, film, television. We went from centuries to introducing new technologies by the decades. And let's look at laptop computers, video games, internet, email, Xboxes, video games, I said video games, and then jump into the 2000s. I have an exercise where I ask my students to examine their own media use and then interview a grandparent or interview a parent. And they spend so much time with these things. And then they're surprised. It's like, oh, my grandparents, they didn't have toys. They played with brooms and pots and pans. And they didn't have a telephone in their house. How could they live? But this idea that this generation is immersed in these, and note I said et cetera. Well, I think as we study communication, is it possible that these young people coming along today are essentially different kinds of communicative critters? Don't tell them I call them critters, but are we different? And where are some of the areas we see differences? We see differences in young people. They have new identities as avatars in fictitious cyber or virtual worlds. We have new ways of organizing ourselves, talking with customer service in Asia, meeting future dates and spouses online, or just maintaining connection or disconnections with family and friend. Less time in face-to-face communication, and perhaps declining face-to-face communication skills for a whole new generation. Or even, heaven forbid, as Sherry Turkle talks about in her book Alone Together, a preference by some for communicating with robots rather than flesh and blood people. Yikes. So emergence, how are these technologies changing us? Think about other institutions that produce information. Book publishing, and this is very important to many of our lives in more than one way. How many of you have a Kindle or a Nook? You traitor to our fields. I have one. I feel like a traitor every time I pick it up. But book publishing, newspapers. I finally canceled my newspaper subscription, I think for the last time. I just read it online. The music industry, iPods, iTunes, and you may not be aware of this, but religion is going through a dramatic, particularly our mainline Protestant churches, they have lost dramatic numbers of people, and they are reformulating themselves. And when I hear about MOOCs, massive online open, massive open online courses that are being offered by some of our universities and some of their consortiums, I wonder what higher ed is going to look like in 20 years or 10 years or 5 years. I just think, hold on to your hats. We're going through a very interesting time. And so I argue that emergence is a theme that connects us. We have divisions that focus on that specifically, but how can we study interpersonal communication? How can we study anything that we do and not take into account emergence? The final area that I want to ask us to think about is ethics or ethical communication. And it's almost like I take us to the future with emergence, and now I'm swinging us back. Stephen Beebe said that in his call that our discipline is 2,500 years old. And so think about Aristotle, think about Plato. Jim Golden has ruined me for lies. Rhetoric is the discovery of all the available means of persuasion. The three appeals of rhetoric, persuasive rhetoric, are ethos, logos, and pathos. Well, let's stop on ethos. Ethos is the credibility of the speaker, but we can associate it with ethical communication. And I would love to make the argument communication is important, but guess what? NCA has already done that for me. On the NCA webpage, in our mission-like statement, one of the statements says that NCA explicitly is dedicated to fostering and promoting free and ethical communication. We are called to foster and model civil discourse, and open ethical communication is one of our strategic goals. And we even have a division, of course, dedicated to ethics, and they talk about ethics being an important part of every part of the human communication process. So I don't have to make the argument that ethics is something that unites us. NCA and the ethics division have already done that. But what I do want to suggest is that from this, in terms of our practice of communication, there are three things I think we need to be concerned with. One is, as NCA is dedicated, one is we need to be public advocates for civil discourse. Those of us who work in organizations, we're familiar with the language of cultural communication competence, and people who are in disparate areas of, not necessarily in communication, who are calling for compassionate communication as a strategy to make people's lives richer, fuller, and to help us have conversations with people of different backgrounds, not only on a local level, but even on a global level. A second thing that I want to ask us to think about in terms of ethics is, and this follows what our division suggests, we need to be concerned with communication ethics education. How are we engaging our students in our classrooms on ethics? Maybe people in health science do that. Maybe those of you who do legal communication, and of course those of you in rhetoric are probably doing it, but what about the rest of us? How are we preparing them from ethics? If a third of young people don't identify as themselves as religious, and they spend a lot of time playing video games, killing and blowing each other up, where are they getting a sense of morality? Do we have a role in the academy? I think it's at least worth a conversation. And then finally, I suggest that we need to have an ethical conversation on graduate education. There are a lot of graduate students in the room. And you're at universities, some of you are at Research One, and we're trying to recreate you into Research One professors on tenure track lines. And guess what we know is happening in higher education? Tenure track lines are disappearing. More and more instructor lines are appearing. Some of the people who think they're going Research One may indeed find themselves at a liberal arts school. Nothing wrong with that. They may be at that Research One on an instructor track. So my argument is that we need to have that conversation with our graduate students to let them know what's possible. And again, no one knows, we don't have a crystal ball, but I would encourage that indeed that is a conversation. So in conclusion, those are the wonderful words, aren't they? I would would like to suggest that we are engaged in an unending conversation. Many of you are familiar with Kenneth Burke's piece talking about the unending conversation. And there's a part that he has in there that I really like that talks about you enter the conversation, you're a part of it, and then as you get older, you leave it. And he says at the very end, the hour grows late, you must depart, and you do depart, with the discussion still vigorously in progress. I would like to argue that our discussion on what unites us is not a new argument. It's been going on, and I really hope in future conversations and in future conventions it continues. Thank you.
What unites us as a community, I think, is a shared notion of the ideal to which rhetoric should aspire, and a dedicated effort to understand its use in practice and to expose the extent to which that use falls short of the ideal. And what I'm going to suggest first is where I draw my ideals, draw sources of ideals, and then how we've fallen short, and then how we've fallen less than short, and then raise a challenge. I'm going to draw on Aristotle, Isocrates, and Quintilian as one unit, Carl Wallace, rhetoric scholar, and Thomas Jefferson in order to set down the aspiration. From Aristotle, rhetoric is the art of selecting, discovering the best from among the available means of persuasion, with the end of rhetoric being judgment. And by judgment, I think we understand collectively that rhetoric can, in fact, constrict our capacity to judge, and rhetoric can enhance our capacity to judge. And rhetoric at its best, the rhetoric of person speaking well, Isocrates, Quintilian, enhances our capacity to judge carefully, to judge thoughtfully, to judge justly. It doesn't constrict our capacity as humans by minimizing our ability to make those kinds of judgments that serve the common good and not simply that serve our own individual interests when those are in conflict. From Carl Wallace, 4 moralities of communication. The speaker should, 1, search and inquire. 2, be accurate, fair, and just in the use of argument. 3, be willing to submit private motivation to public scrutiny. And 4, be tolerant of dissent. I would alter the last one a little bit by saying to embrace dissent. So to the notion of best from the available means and good person speaking well in a way that enhances our capacity to judge well, I would add those 4 moralities of communication as an aspiration I think we as a community share. And then finally from Thomas Jefferson, who set down the rules of the House of Representatives in order to create a process conducive to deliberation. Jefferson, in those House rules that are followed to this day, wrote that speakers, and by that he meant speakers on the floor of the House, shall confine themselves to the issue in question and avoid personalities. And by that he meant that even if you believe that a person lies, you do not call the person a liar. Even if you believe that a person's motives are venal, you do not accuse the person of being a venal person. And he set this in place, and the House rigorously enforces that as a norm, with an automatic taking down censuring process if one person calls another a liar, for example, because he knew at the point at which we discredit the individual as a person, we make it impossible to continue to engage in a rhetorical exchange that can lead us to a kind of collective consent and assent. We, in other words, make a process of collective judgment all but impossible because we've written people out of our community. And so from Aristotle, Quintilian, Isocrates, Carl Wallace, and Thomas Jefferson, I think we draw our aspiration, our ideals for rhetoric. And I think these ideals are important as we move to our second function. engaging in our dedicated effort to understand the uses of rhetoric and to expose those moments in which it falls short of the ideal. Hence, I turn to the 2012 campaign. Today, the Pew organization issued its finding, its survey of those who came into their random national sample, and they'd asked them to assess the campaign, essentially to assess the quality of the campaign. Now, embedded in that are implied norms. Here's what the first sentence of the Pew report, issued at 12 o'clock noon today, said. The 2012 campaign was a frustrating experience for many voters who say the campaign was more negative than usual and had less discussion of issues than previous campaigns. Voters are astute rhetorical critics. This, in fact, was a campaign year, at the presidential level at least, in which there was a higher level of attack and a lower level of advocacy than in any year that we have studied, 52 to the present, with the general election as the base. And this is an election in which there was a lower level of issue engagement than in some, but not most, of previous elections. We ought to worry about that, since rhetoric is our vehicle for coming to know those who would like to govern or to continue to govern, and those who are offering us, presumably, the choices that once made translate into governance. Did we serve the Aristotelian ideal of informed judgment? Well, when our level of attack was so high that it was difficult this year to find the advocacy that would tell us what they would do when they govern. Did we serve Carl Wallace's ideals well, when candidates on both sides misrepresented the positions of the other, and in which exchanges in which one side accused the other of lying were accepted almost without commentary? And as an historical note, when you go back to 1996, the allegation by one candidate that another had lied in the primaries was so noteworthy that it was the subject of extended journalistic commentary. Now we simply take it for granted that each side will make that allegation of the other, thus, with Jefferson's ideal, disqualifying those people from communication on the floor of the House and requiring an automatic taking down process by which the person either apologizes if taken down or must leave the floor for the day and not engage in deliberation. By that standard, some commentators on Fox and MSNBC would have been off air for the entire election. And to get a sense of what it means when we substitute personalities for argument, I've brought a tape, and Robert behind the curtain is now going to cue this up and play it for you, not for your edification, but for a sense communally of whether or not we have embraced the norm of Thomas Jefferson. If we've embraced the norm, we will experience a collective sense of disgust. If we have not, if we've been so narcotized by exposure that this seems to be acceptable and useful, then we are no longer a community with a shared ideal communicated to us by Jefferson. Robert, was that enough time for you to set the tape up?
Most expensive prostitute.
Drop dead.
You mean when John Boehner played golf with President Obama?
Come on, come on. It'd be like Hitler playing golf with Netanyahu.
A big lie, just like Goebbels. Newt Gingrich is a fat, repulsive pig.
Growing mobs, occupying Wall Street.
The only folks keeping the barbarians from the gates.
As far as I'm concerned, the Tea Party can go straight to hell.
We would treat them pretty ugly down in Texas.
Let's take these son of a bitches out.
The Republican health care plan is this. Die quickly.
Democrats released a health care bill which essentially said to America's seniors, drop dead.
I came here last year and accused President Bush of being a liar.
Illegal.
A den of lying liars and crap weasels who are all behind the scenes trying to figure out who to hang out to dry.
And I think it just shows his character of lying, which he's a professional at.
Well, a professional.
Oh, he's a professional liar.
I've never seen a vice president that has made as many mistakes, said as many stupid things. I mean, there's a real fear if, God forbid, he ever had to be entrusted with the presidency, whether he really has the mental capacity to handle it.
This president stole. He didn't cut Medicare. He stole $700 billion from Medicare to fund Obamacare.
We sometimes imagine that back in the Republican green room there's this giant crack pipe that they're all hitting on constantly, hitting it hard.
So we know you're hooking, but you're just not cheap.
This lobbyist, this K Street whore.
They understand it's a little bit of uppity-ism.
They just make up stuff.
The bat crap crazy wing of the Republican Party and its out-of-control leader, Michelle Bachmann.
I thought he was kind of a dick yesterday.
Oh my God.
Maybe this is an ideology only fools and clowns can actually believe in, and that's the Republican problem.
We looked at paired comparisons, so we selected the language to be identical and looked for instances on the left and the right, so attacking someone as Hitler, for example. And we looked at the extent to which you would learn that someone had been attacked as Hitler, or someone had said that another was Hitler or Hitler-like, on MSNBC, Fox, and CNN. What we found was that if you lived in Fox world, you were very likely to know that that label had been applied to the governor of Wisconsin, the Republican governor of Wisconsin. And if you lived in MSNBC world, you were very likely to know that label had been applied in the form of a placard or poster to Barack Obama. But you are far less likely to know the alternative. And across the categories we were looking at of incivility, we concluded that if you watched MSNBC, you would believe there was a problem in the culture. It was deep and it was serious. And it was on which side? And if you watched MSNBC and Fox, you would have mirror images of each other, but the assumption would be the breach of the norm was all the other side's fault. There is no community when we are incapable of recognizing breaches of our norms, our communicative norms, when they occur on our own side. And we are not likely to have those norms followed on either side if we are not ready to stand up when our own side breaches and reinforce the norm. But in the current media culture, that is far less likely to happen than it once was, and that is highly problematic. Is there any good news in all of this? Yes, there is. We also know that the Jeffersonian ideal of civility was more or less well honored in the presidential debates. There you also had the opportunity to see the two candidates engage on issues, not as well as we would like, but engage on issues and gain a common understanding of where they agree about what we ought to do and where they differ about what we ought to do. The level of advocacy in debates is far higher than it is in ads. It approaches the level of advocacy in presidential speeches, which, contrary to the perception offered in media, do not spend most of their time attacking the opponent. They do spend most of their time at the presidential level advocating for one side, that is, the side that's advancing the case. And so in presidential debates, we saw a model of communication closer to that to which we aspire. We also saw it this year in the rise of fact-checking in journalism. I founded factcheck.org in 2003 because I thought largely journalism had given up its role as custodian of fact and engaged in he said, she said journalism instead of arbitrating when there were in fact knowable bases for saying that one side was more accurate than the other, or in some cases neither side was accurate, or in some cases both were accurate, but they were simply ships in the night, they lacked a common definition. In 2003, factcheck.org was all alone, which is why Vice President Cheney cited as factcheck.com, as a result sending millions of people to the wrong website, where factcheck.org, but they did ultimately find us. Well, we weren't alone this year. The AP aggressively fact-checked virtually everything that moved, as did Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post, as did PolitiFact headed by Bill Adair, as did major news networks, particularly news networks that were distributing national news in print. What that led to was a backlash against fact-checking, with one campaign saying that it would not have its communication strategy dictated by the fact-checkers. I am relieved to report to you that the behavior that they engaged in was, by the campaign's own data, punished by voters. When the Romney campaign began airing its misleading ads suggesting that Jeep was transporting U.S. jobs to China, the campaigns now believe there was what we once called a backlash, which would suggest that the capacity of the audience to judge was not so tarnished by this campaign environment as to be immune to testimony, in this case by the head of the Chrysler Corporation, which said they had no such intent. We also did a study in which we looked at 26 knowledge claims, some of them deceptively argued by the campaigns in the form of their advertising, and across a 5-wave study with panel back as well as set-aside samples. That's just for those of you who said, oh my God, she's going to come up and be a rhetoric scholar for the entire 20 minutes. What we found was that people learned as a result of exposure to fact-checking in the presence of rigorous controls, including controlling for close following and education, saying that you went to a fact-checking site or to a journalistic site that was engaged in fact-checking in order to determine whether something was accurate, predicted increased knowledge by a 10% difference against those who did not say so but were in all other ways comparable. So there were facets of this election that did work. The structures of communication did enhance the capacity of the audience to judge based on what was knowable and also to judge comparatively about advocacy. If, in fact, what we share is a commitment to the notion of the ideal of what rhetoric should be, if we believe that the end is judgment and that good rhetoric, the rhetoric of the good person speaking well, doesn't constrict but expands, enhances, deepens that judgment, if we believe that there are moralities of communication, including fair, accurate, and just use of argument, if we do believe that it's inappropriate to engage in personalities, that we should engage each other on the issues and on policies, not on attacks on the person, and if we are dedicated to understanding how well rhetoric is functioning against these ideals and exposing it when it is not, then I would conclude with a challenge to us as a discipline. If we're able to do all of those things, to articulate the ideals, to find those areas in which there is a lapse, to call out those instances in which rhetoric is falling short, then I think our challenge is to find and implement ways to close the gap between what it is we do in this body politic and what we aspire to as scholars who understand rhetoric.
Well, what do you think? How would you answer the question? You'll have a chance to do that tomorrow. Is it biology? Is that what brings us here as a community? Is it our differences, our diversity, that gives us a sense of common pursuit? Is it emergence, technology, and understanding that emergence in contemporary society? Or is it our ethics and our pursuit of the good? Or could it be, undergirding all of that, is our pursuit of rhetorical ideas? What do you think? Hold it until 9:30 tomorrow. Next door in the Hemisphere 4 room at 9:30, you'll have a chance to respond. The 3 speakers will be there, perhaps respond to each other. And we'll also have coffee and pastries for you as well to enhance that conversation. We have begun this evening to celebrate community cerebrally with ideas. I now invite you to continue the celebration in 2 ways in practice. First, As we adjourn to our reception in just a moment, you'll have a chance to donate to the NCA book drive. In fact, at our reception will be some of the students and some of the teachers who will benefit by that book drive. So I remind you of that opportunity to share and enrich the Orlando community with your generosity. And then we will adjourn, not lakeside, as some of you may have discovered as you were coming here. There was a slight mist in the air. So I invite you to continue the celebration by, rather than traveling over to the Swan, what you simply do, we will celebrate in the Pacific Ballroom. How do you get there? It's very simple. Exit those doors, turn right. Down at the hallway, turn right. There'll be folks there directing you. May the celebration continue. Thank you.